Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education. Our conversation today is with Dr. Sarah Bolles-Fye and Dr. Marche Newkirk. Dr. Sarah Bolles-Fye has served public school students in South Florida as a teacher and literacy specialist for over 10 years and is currently supporting Somerset Academy Incorporated, a charter school network based in Florida with over 75 schools in the United States. Dr. Fye holds a Bachelor's of Arts in English from Florida State University, a Master of Science in Reading and Literacy Education from Florida International University, and a Doctorate of Education in Educational Leadership from the University of Pennsylvania. With experience ranging from classroom teacher to virtual school teacher to reading coach to literacy specialist to network strategic planning, Dr. Fye has served and led teams working with schools and staff desiring improvement by observing faculty and administrators, mentoring educators, and creating plans of action for school improvement by working with site and district administrators through research-based data collection and analysis practices. Dr. Fye is a member of the International Literacy Association, a facilitator of coursework for the Penn Literacy Network at the University of Pennsylvania, and a RILE Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. She is the co-host of the Big Ideas in Education podcast and focuses her research and life's work on relationships and teacher retention. Dr. Marche Newkirk is a career educator with over 20 years of experience serving public school students and families in New York and New Jersey. Her work as a teacher in the South Bronx served as a springboard for a career in educational leadership and advocacy for children in historically marginalized and underappreciated communities. She is the lead founder of an independent charter school in Newark, New Jersey, where she served as the school's executive director for 8 years. Marche provides leadership coaching and training for new and aspiring leaders through her work at New Leaders. In addition, she is an independent consultant offering leadership coaching with a focus on reimagining best practices in schools in order to disrupt the status quo. Marche has earned master's degrees in elementary education and administration and supervision from Lehman College and Fordham University, respectively, and holds a doctorate in educational and organizational leadership from the University of Pennsylvania. Hi, Marche and Sarah, how are you?
Hi.
Hi, doing well.
Doing very well.
It's so exciting to have you on our podcast today. I really appreciate you being here. And this conversation is going to be exciting for a lot of reasons. First of all, I love both of you and that you're on here. But this is also the first time we're having two people on at the same time. So it'll be quite an adventure. And then also, this podcast episode is about charter schools. So you're our first non-independent school folks that we have interviewed. So this is going to be exciting.
It's an honor. Hope we make you proud, Michael.
So we like to start by asking our guests to talk to us a little bit about how they got into education and what their education journey from where they started to where they are now has looked like. So maybe Sarah, could you go first?
Sure. I was kind of a field changer. I was not. I didn't intend to go into education when I fell into it, I guess I could say. I graduated and anticipated perhaps teaching for a few years and then going back to graduate school, getting my PhD in literature, actually, and maybe teaching at a university level. But I taught my first year in downtown Miami, which I'm from Miami. So I went back home and I just completely fell in love with the kids and the profession. And I was very blessed to be mentored by some amazing educators who really just invested in me and blessed me with their time and energy. And I realized that this was something I was extremely passionate about. And so the plan changed a bit and I ended up getting my master's in literacy and was fortunate enough to just recently get my doctorate in education with two amazing people who are on this episode as well. And so I have been a classroom teacher, a curriculum coach, a literacy coach, and now an administrator for a charter school network that's based here in South Florida.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I love how many people we've had on our podcast whose stories start with they fell into education, like they started and then fell in love with it and just kept going. I think that's awesome. That probably makes for the best teachers. Marche, can you talk to us about your journey in education?
I sure can. So similarly, I was a psych major. I had gone to school with, determination to become a child psychologist. But ended up in a straight psych program, minoring in education because of a mentor that I had. He was actually my advisor, who kept saying, I know you're interested in child psychology, but you just seem like you're a teacher. And so he had actually given me my first teaching opportunity as a TA for him in my senior year. I worked with his freshman Psych 101 class. And so fast forward, I graduate and I'm still like, no, I'm not going to become a teacher. I think that I still am interested in counseling. So I'm going to go get my MSW. Applied to one program, which didn't work out. And I think there was a reason for that. Subsequently ended up going into Teach for America, which was a very young organization at the time, and had been recruiting very heavily at my college campus. And I was, closing my ears to TFA. A year after I graduated, decided to go ahead and join TFA. I started teaching in the South Bronx a long time ago, and stayed in the classroom in the South Bronx, Mount Vernon, New York, and a very short stint in an Upper Westchester community that looked nothing like where I had started my teaching, which really solidified for me that I was going to devote my career to urban education. I thought I would only teach for 5 years. I had 5 years, that's it. So 11 years in the classroom, transitioned from teaching into a program called New Leaders. At the time, it was New Leaders for New Schools, which was explicitly a principal preparation program, and became the lower school director at a charter school in the Bronx. And then in 2010, transitioned to Newark, New Jersey, where I had the opportunity to write a charter and found a school that I led for 8 years. That feels like forever, but it's been a long journey and a great one for the most part.
That's incredible. That's a lot of amazing experience. So I'm really excited to have you on to share some of that with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this episode is about charter schools. Over the last decade, charter schools have become highly competitive alternatives to independent schools. And this is especially true among millennials who, as a group, have a large amount of student loan debt and are still dealing with the negative effects of the 2008 recession. So the National Association of Independent Schools Trendbook has noted that charter schools are becoming more competitive with that group. So it's unclear, as charter schools have grown, how much independent school leaders really even know about them. And that's what we want to talk with you guys about today. We hope you're going to give us a crash course in charter schools, what they are and the basics of how they function. So, Sarah, what is a charter school?
Well, a charter school basically is a public school. It's a free public school available for any public school child who's in the what you might call the service area of whatever area that school is operating in, which sounds strange to some people because some people think that charter schools are maybe tuition based or some form of non-public school, but essentially it is a public school. It's free. It is a school that is the name charter comes from the way that it is written or applied for, which you will probably hear me say more than once today, depends very heavily on where you apply to build this charter school or where this charter school is operating. There are different regulations, different rules, different application processes, depending on what your local education agency or LEA mandates for that area. But essentially, a charter school is a free public school for students that sometimes has a specific goal or maybe a specific mandate that they are looking to serve. For example, sometimes there are charters that are dedicated to arts. There are some charters that are dedicated to serving students with autism. There are some charters that are dedicated to very specific goals and missions. But that's not the case for all of them. So just kind of like there are public schools that are designed that way.
So, Marche, could you tell us a little bit about what are the similarities and differences between a charter school and an independent school?
Well, I will tell you, Matt, that in the same way that independent school folks don't know a whole lot about charter schools, I would say that I don't know a whole lot about independent schools.
Aha, okay.
And so, but I would say, one, I want to just stress Sarah's point that charter schools are public schools, because often folks will say, does your child go to a district or a public school? But, charter or public. And so charters are public. But I think the other thing that I wanted to add is that, and maybe there are some similarities here with independent schools, but the idea of charter schools, which really originated with someone named Al Schenker, was that these would be schools of choice and innovation. And part of the purpose, aside from giving parents choice, was really, and I think this is so important, that these innovation labs, if you will, would provide strategies that could be turnkeyed to the broader field of public education, right? So it was never to, improve just the quality of education for children that attended charter schools, but it was supposed to have an effect on the overall performance of public schools and really elevate the experiences that children were having. So that's my addition. I know that doesn't really speak to the independent school piece, but
that's great
about charters. Yeah,
you said that much better than I did, Marta.
Dream work makes the dream work.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, could you go into a little more detail about the difference between a public school, like my kids go to public school right down the street, and a charter school? You talked about choice. You talked about innovation. What else might be different?
Sure. I think when you're in a charter school, one of the most stressful components of leading or working in a charter school, or even sending your children there, is this authorization process. So one, I had to go through a very extensive process to first write a charter, assemble a board and a staff. Most public schools are not going through those iterations.
Gotcha.
And to recruit students. Once you get through that, you've got this authorization process. Your school is approved every 4 to 5 years. Your authorizer comes back to evaluate your performance. Your performance is based on a number of factors. First and foremost, test scores. And so you can have, what parents and staff feel is an amazing school environment that falls short of, the goals that it set for academic performance as measured by test scores. And your authorizer could say, I'm sorry, you're not meeting the bar. And so charter schools can be closed much more rapidly, and in some cases more easily, than a traditional public school. And I think that is one major difference. However, for that level of, I almost want to say like scrutiny, there comes a greater degree of autonomy, right? And so this idea of innovation comes from, one, a lot of charter schools, as Sarah alluded to, have specific themes. And so you have more room, more leverage. You're choosing your own curriculum. You can, in most cases, and it does vary by region, by state, whether or not there's union involvement. There are lots of factors that determine just how much leeway charters have in terms of the staff that they hire, the certification requirements, depending on the state. And so there's this greater degree of autonomy versus what a traditional district school might experience.
And if I can add to that, that authorization piece that Marche is talking about is definitely one of the major differences. And what most people might associate with a traditional public school is that it is municipality or it is locality run, right? Run and operated. So perhaps your local school district, like for example, in Florida where I live, there are 66 school districts because there are 66 counties in Florida. So each county has its own local school district. And in other parts of the country, it's run very differently, but it's based on geographic region for the most part. And so those school districts are put together, they have an elected board, and they are the authorizer for the public schools within that geographic region. There are other types of authorizers. For example, a university might be an authorizer for a charter school. The lines sometimes get a little blurry. I'll tell you, it's a little confusing sometimes. For example, here in Florida, where charters have been around for, I believe, over 25 years. So it's not really a brand new thing here in Florida, but there are still new rules all the time. There are even some public school districts who have written their own charters and are now operating charter schools within the local school district. So I can definitely understand how listeners would listen and say, this is a little confusing. Why they sound very similar. There are a lot of similarities, but as Marche said, for the most part, especially with the inception and what the original idea for charter schools was to provide parents choice. So for example, living in a geographic region like I do in Miami, it's a very large district. It's it's just a very large district. And so if I live in this neighborhood, I am only allowed to go to the neighborhood school. My child is only allowed to go to the school that, I am zoned for. What charters allow for is kind of a break of that. So geographically, you have that choice. Again, if you have a decision about curriculum that gives parents choice to want to go to this particular school, to have this kind of mentality, if you agree with this educational ideology versus that educational ideology, these are the kinds of choices that are provided. And that is really a school of choice. Choice is the word that separates a charter from a traditional public school.
Cool. So let's talk about money for a minute. So money is very important for independent schools to function. I recognize that charter schools are publicly funded, but can you talk about more specifics? How are charter schools funded? What are their major revenue streams and how, I know they get government money and there's a lot of grants. Can you just talk about that for a moment?
Sure. I'll start a little bit with that. So again, I think that how much money and how money is allocated is very different depending on where your charter is and who your authorizer is. Locally in the state of Florida, we have something called FTE, which is basically our per pupil allocation. So this is the amount of money each school receives per student from the state. And that gets distributed through your local school district. Even if you're a charter school, it gets distributed through your local school district. So from that money, you have to pay a fee to your sponsor, which is your local education agency. You pay a fee to them. And from the rest of the money, you have to pay salaries, you pay curriculum, you pay for facilities, you pay for everything else. And so because that amount of money in the state of Florida is somewhat limited, definitely we seek out grants for different things. We can seek out federal grants, we can seek out private grants, we can seek out money to help support the educational goals of whatever our schools are doing. And some schools receive grants federally for certain reasons. So there's some grants that are pretty popular that most schools would qualify for. There are, for example, Title I grants, which are federal grants that are available for schools who are serving students who are higher in poverty. Their families are coming from higher poverty areas, or they are living below a certain level of income. And that's identified by their free and reduced lunch status. Title II is a professional development grant that most schools qualify for. Title IV, Title V. So all of these are federal grants that a lot of, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of charter schools would qualify for. And those funds come with a lot of requirements, but they also come with opportunities to use to serve those students.
That's great. Do either of you have just a rough estimate? I know it's probably not possible to have an exact number, but what is the lower bound and upper bound on how much a charter school would get per student?
That varies significantly based on where you are operating.
What would sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say in New Jersey, there's a rough average of 85 to 90%, right? But that can vary. So in one school, the per pupil might be for the district could be $24,000 that the district is spending per pupil, but the charter school is only seeing 90% of that. And in many cases, it's actually significantly less. And just a couple of differences between New Jersey and Florida, as Sarah just explained. So our funding primarily comes from the state. The state determines the budget, and that goes to the district. So if you're running an independent charter school like I did, which we were actually our own local education agency, which means that one school was its own school district. But we were part of, when it came to funding, the larger district, which was the city of Newark. Okay. So the state determines how much money the city of Newark's schools, public schools as a whole, should receive. And then that money is allocated to charter schools. And again, charters will see 90% on average of what the city of Newark would see. At some point in time, the funding is often impacted by charter enrollment, although New Jersey has been flat funded for about 5 or 6 years now, which means as charter school expansion is happening within networks, their funding is remaining the same. So they actually have less per pupil spending by the state. Something else that's really, I think, notable for New Jersey, you have to be able to run your program from inception, and each year that you prepare your annual budget, you have to be able to show that you can run your program only on state funding. And so while there are all of these grant opportunities that exist both publicly and privately, you've got to first show that the state aid that's allocated to your school is sufficient for you to run the innovative program that you have set out to operate.
Okay. That is an excellent point, and that is also accurate. That last point about how when you write your charter, you have to prove that you can run it without all those grants is true. And just to give you a little bit of perspective on the variability of funding, Marche mentioned that the district might get $24,000 per student, and then the charters would receive 80 to 90% of that. In the state of Florida, it is closer to $9,000 per student, and again, the charters do not receive that full amount because there are, things that come out of that go to the sponsor. So I don't quote me, but most schools that I have worked with, we're looking at roughly a $7,000 per pupil allocation. Wow, so it is quite variable.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got lots of questions. So much of that I don't understand. Okay, first of all, the 90%. Help me understand the logic behind. I mean, obviously, we would all want the full 100%.
I will say there are a lot of calculations that go into why, and that changes so much based on where you are. From where I work and operate, for the most part, it's generally because we do have to pay a certain portion to our sponsor district, which is our local education agency, LEA. So used to saying LEA, I forget what it means sometimes. But so that's a portion that goes to them that is to cover fees, indirect costs, all sorts of things that I'm not the budget person to ask, but there's breakdowns that go into that. But it is definitely not apples to apples when it comes to funding for public charter schools.
Okay. Oh, that's a shame. So the 90% tuition. And then my other question,
which is also why you'll hear sometimes that charters try to make, we do more with less. That is something you hear about in the charter school world.
Well, that gets kicked around in the independent school world too, somewhat. So then the concept that you have to prove that you can operate only on state funding. Help me understand the principle behind that. I mean, why wouldn't you want to go make more money elsewhere?
Right. And so I don't know where that line of thinking originates, but
Okay.
if I could sort of take a gander at it, it is an attempt at equity, right? To say that you should be able to provide a quality education for the same amount of money that it takes in school A as in school B. I don't necessarily agree with that because I think it does depend on the needs of each independent population and at the school population, that is. But at the same time, if the goal of charters was to be innovative, right, then it wasn't really about money, right? Like what we were saying was that there were ways that we could teach. There was something about the way we engaged with students and families, built school culture, and paid attention to instructional strategies that if we did this in a specific way, irrespective of money, then we would see better results than our traditional public schools, right? That really is the charge. And I can say, you know, when I went through the process of writing and being authorized, that was a pervasive message from the state. This is supposed to be about doing it differently, not because you have money, but because your practices, although we could also argue that some practices cost more money, which is also why charter schools then do the fundraising that they do, right? And so there is that flexibility to raise those funds from private funders to enhance your program.
Right, but not for operations.
But those are only enhancements. Yeah. But your core program needs to be strong enough to stand on state funding.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Marche just said. And I would just add that from a purely fiscal standpoint, I think that the rationale also has to do with the fact that you're not guaranteed other funding. So if I apply for a grant, I'm not guaranteed those grant funds. If I have a partner with an organization or a business, who's to say that they won't go out of business 1 year from now? And then the funding that I was counting on for my school is not going to be there. Yeah. So I think it's also a way to kind of ensure
responsibility.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, that I can understand.
Yeah. I'm curious. Again, I know there's a lot of variation, but what would an estimate be like for the average charter school? When you take into account any fundraising and government grants that they've received, what percentage of their operational budget ends up just being the money that they were given from the government?
I mean, the answer would be completely different for every school. I don't think that is standardized at all. You have some schools that don't receive any additional or outside funding, and they do only survive on the state allocation or their local allocation. It's hard to imagine how, because that is a very tight budget. But I mean, it is financially possible because you have to make sure that those budgets are approved. So if you weren't able to do it, you would not be in operation. But I would agree with Marche that with innovation and with choice and with all of the things that we strive towards, as you go on, those things increase. And I would say it's also, as she also mentioned, that each school population costs a different amount. It's tough when you're in a state like Florida, for example. A lot of Florida geographically is rural and the cost of living is relatively low. But if you live in a place like I do, like Miami, where the cost of living is very high and things are very expensive, imagine facilities cost a lot more. Salaries just to keep people employed so that they can have a living wage, which we can get into another conversation, but it's been proven that in Miami and in South Florida, teachers cannot survive on the wage that they are given in South Florida because the cost of living is just too high. Wow. So there are a lot of issues that go into it. But as far as how much is grants and fundraised and how much of it is state and federal, there definitely is nothing standardized that I can think of. Marche, I don't know if you've...
No, in my first year, I raised over $500,000, right? And then I would apply for smaller grants in the subsequent years. by the time I left, I would say the last 3 years that I was there, which were the 6th, 7th, and 8th years of the school, we were not actually fundraising at all.
Right.
We were
And I would say that's
I'm sorry, Sarah.
No. I was just going to say that's pretty remarkable. I would say that's atypical. Marche doesn't always give herself enough credit, but for a standalone charter school, that is a remarkable amount of fundraising and a remarkable amount of money to be able to put into one school.
Definitely. And I thank you for that, Sarah. And I'll also say, though, I think depending for independent charters, fundraising is much more difficult, right? Because unless you can afford to have a development person, then it means that you are in the state of New Jersey, you'd be called the lead person, which might be your CEO or executive director. That person is supposed to be out fundraising, but also ensuring the day-to-day operations of the school run smoothly. And so unless you have someone really dedicated, it's pretty challenging. But something that's really common in New York and New Jersey are charter networks that function. Sarah, when you say LEA, I think about those charter networks functioning as a local education agency. So in New Jersey, a charter school network might consist of 20 campuses. In fact, there is one such organization here in New Jersey that has about 20 campuses. And so I would venture to say that development is baked into their budget, right? That because they are so expansive, they really have a very strong infrastructure that allows for them to project how much money they want to raise each year. And then they have dedicated departments, forget about, like one person, but a dedicated department that's able to really focus on fundraising.
And that is different from network to network. And I would agree with Marche that is, so LEA means something different down here. Like she said, we use for charter networks down here and in some parts of the country, CMO is a term you might hear also. It's just charter management organization. So I work for a network. We consider ourselves a CMO because we manage our charters. And then we have, there are different types of CMO. So some are run and operated by their CMO, and some are run and operated, but maybe outsource certain parts of their management or parts of their operations to an education service provider. So there are different models that work within this, but I would agree with Marche that the larger your network is, to an extent, because as someone who does work for a larger organization, we have over 75 active charters right now. I will say it is not that easy as well. So what Marche did when she founded her school also was quite remarkable. It is not easy. It is easier, I would say, when you have a large number of schools, almost like in a business sense. If you only have one sub shop, it's going to be hard to get your name out there and hard to get people to believe in you and invest in you versus somebody like Subway or Quiznos, where they have so many that it's going to be easier to get people with name recognition and people who understand your brand and who understand your product and to get them to invest or to believe that this isn't a good investment to put in, okay, you know what, they would be a good applicant because they already have demonstrated all of this versus when you're standalone independent charter, even if you have the years of experience, it's hard to prove that you have the staying power.
In terms of raising money, a charter school is not a 501c3, correct? Or do you form separate sort of booster 501c3s?
We did form a 501c3. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes,
okay.
I would. And so does the one I work for as well. So I don't know of any for-profit charters, but I am sure they exist. I don't know if you know of any, Marche?
By definition, I don't know that.
I don't know
that that's possible, right? Because charters are public schools.
They are public. Perhaps there are some for-profit networks.
I would say
perhaps,
there are an unfortunate amount of for-profit.
Thank you. I should have said that's
right.
That's not a popular statement.
No, it's not.
But she's
right. Yes, and that is a very different thing. Where individual, I should say, not independent, but individual schools would not be for profit. However, some charter networks, CMOs or LEAs, and depending on where you're coming from, and what region you're in, may be for profit. I don't personally work for a for-profit charter network, but they do exist. Some of them are very popular, as Marche alluded to. They are more popular outside of where I live than where I do live. But Marche in the Northeast, they are very popular and actually growing in Florida and in Texas and California. So they have a very extensive reach.
Okay, so one more question, and then we'll get off of the money. Since these schools are public schools, do teachers get all of the same municipal benefits in their packages?
So that is a really good question. I would say not necessarily by definition. However, local agencies and local regulations may require that. So that is not a guarantee in a charter school. So, for example, in places, I go back to it really depends on where you live and where you're operating, because if your local municipality regulates that is so, yes, that will happen. That is not the case where I live in Florida, and that is worth most of the places where I have been. That is not the case.
Interesting. Well, that adds quite a bit to the cost then. So I would think then that the larger networks could capitalize on the cost sharing in terms of health benefits and things like that.
Benefits, payroll, yes, those kinds of like HR, back office things. The larger networks could help support that cost. You're right.
But is it also true that they don't follow the same like pay bands that local public schools would follow? Like, do they?
I would say they may not.
They may not. Okay.
They may not. In a place like, again, I always go back to where I live because it's where I've worked my entire professional career and it's where my experience is. But it would be very difficult, and it is very difficult to hire educators in South Florida if you are not willing to pay what the district would pay, if not more. Because we are, and we have been for the past 5 years or so, been in a teacher shortage. So if you are not willing to pay or at least meet the same level of salary and benefits commensurate, if not exactly the same, but commensurate to what they're offering in a public school, competition is real, and you're maybe not going to get the talent that you want in your school.
Yeah. In New Jersey, on the books, and I'd be hard pressed to find it today, but there was language around needing to have salaries that didn't completely outperform the district, right? So salaries needed to be in the same general area, because then that would mean that all of the teachers, the best teachers, would want to go work in charter schools because they were making more. The caveat was if there were significant differences in the responsibilities and requirements, then your salary could reflect that. Mm. So, which is problematic for district schools very often, not all the time, right? But for several years, my charter, we were probably $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 above the district's starting salary, which was significant. Until they renegotiated their contract. And the way that we were able to justify that was that we had a longer school day, right? We were asking teachers to do more things that maybe, in the union environment would have been a lot harder to ask and require teachers to do. And so then that grows, right? So based on the job description, while my charter school was at one point competitive, charter school, that is part of the larger network and is asking for more, could then say, oh, we're going $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 above that. So think about the district, and then the difference between, even for my school, but the difference between what a district teacher versus a charter teacher, depending on the school that they landed and what was being asked of them.
Absolutely. And that's something that in the charter world, we're constantly subject to local changes. There were, not in the most recent election in 2020 now, but in 2016, there were a lot of local county amendments about raising funds for public schools. And so all of those passed. What was not clear is that those districts did not intend to share those funds with charter schools. And so charter parents are very upset right now because they expected that money to go towards their children's schools, where that money might go to raises for public school teachers, are not necessarily going towards raises for charter school teachers. And so then as a charter school operator, you have to determine, am I going to find a way to match the salary? Am I going to potentially lose some of my talent in my teachers? What am I going to do? So we're constantly at the mercy of what local and state mandates do with our money.
Well, let's take it back to the beginning. How is a charter school formed? What are the steps to start a charter school?
I think Marche would be a fantastic, yes, considering she has taken that whole cycle through personally. I think she would be a great person to answer.
And some of this is, again, dependent on the region. In New Jersey, right now, there's been a moratorium on charters. So it's really hard to get a charter school approved right now. But traditionally, there would be an application that the state would release each year. And you basically you try to put together a committee. In the best case scenario, and this is something I wish I could go back and do a little bit more of. In the best case scenario, your committee truly reflects constituents of the community, right? And not just the more prominent folks in the community, but, what do your parents actually want? That committee comes together and determines what their vision and mission for the charter school is. There's a very, very expansive charter school application that is written. It's like writing a book, although there's a template. Everything from soup to nuts, your vision, the specifics of your program, down to a sample daily schedule per grade, curriculum choices per grade, all the way down to the nuts and bolts of your starting budget. Right? And then being able to project that budget out 5 years. Once you submit your application, there's a state review process. By that time, you should have a founding board. There's a state review process. If you manage to make it through that state review process, you're called in for an interview. And you and your committee, which should include your board members, especially your board chair, your finance person, sits before the authorizers. In New Jersey, the State Department of Education is the authorizer. There's an interview process. The state decides, okay, we're going to allow this charter school to advance, but the district has an opportunity to review the charter before there is a final yes. 9 times out of 10, the district will say yes in a charter-friendly environment. Once the district says yes, the founding group is notified and they are actually issued a charter. And that sounds like a lot, but then the work begins, right? And it's recruiting, a larger board to ensure that you have governance in place. And then recruiting staff, students. I literally walked around with my founding committee, walked around the neighborhood, posted at Dunkin' Donuts, right? Giving out flyers, putting signs on buses if you have the money to do that, and beginning to raise money to get some, who believes in our mission and vision. And Sarah, you spoke to that very well. That's high level. That's how you get started. It's a grueling process. For my experience, I started writing the charter in August of 2010. I had a year to complete the charter, onboard staff, recruit students, and we opened in August 2011. And so, yeah,
that's an impressive timeline. That's a very impressive timeline.
It's a crazy timeline. I would not recommend it.
No, not at all. I would agree with everything Marche just said. The only difference where I live is that it's almost flipped, where that the local municipality has to approve first, and then if they do not approve, you may appeal to the state. Although generally, if the local municipality or the local school not approve, in theory, they would have a good reason for it. But as Marche said, it really is dependent on the charter friendliness of that district. There are a lot of there's some political reasons or some bureaucracy reasons why they may not want that school to be in operation in that area. So there are some things in between there. And I would agree that I have also knocked on doors. I have given flyers out at pizza places and houses of worship, and you just go and you meet the families and you try to explain, this is what we do, this is who we are, and we want your family to trust us with your child, which is a big ask.
You've both talked about a little bit about charters having boards, and that's part of the process. Could you speak a little bit about leadership and governance? What does it look like at the different levels of leadership for a charter school? Independent schools are also board run. You have a board who hires the head of school, and the head of school functions essentially as the executive director. But what does leadership look like at a charter school?
As Marche mentioned, when you write your charter, you do need to have at least the beginning of a governing board present. So you need to have the chairman of the board or the president of your board. There is, as far as I know, there is not a set number. There are some boards are made up of 5, 7, 9 members. There are some that are elected. There are some that are not elected. So the kind of board is variable, I would say. And so that can change depending on whether you are, really depending on how you wrote your charter is the truth. And so how it's approved by your authorizer. If you are an independent standalone charter, you have a single governing board. If you are a network, for example, you may have 30 schools under one governing board. But I would also say that while that board is responsible for the decision-making and the operations and the oversight, I would say that there's always another layer, because you have your local authorizer, whether that's a school board, whether that's the state. So while, yes, you're reporting to your board, there are outside agencies that also have a say in how you run your school.
With the outside agencies, as you're getting your school up and running, I know you talked about the importance of test scores and how your school could be closed. And you said in some cases pretty quickly.
Yes,
is there a certain
absolutely.
amount of time that you have to get established to meet certain goals before your school would be closed? Or is it like you're up and running and by the end of the first year, you have to meet certain testing standards or it's over?
So I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen a couple of ways. If you have a safe environment, positive school culture, then you may be granted more time, right? So
yes.
in New Jersey, we had 3 full years to operate. There was an initial visit by the authorizer in that first year just to come in and take a look. Had we established, strong practices? Did we seem like we were on our way? And then after 3 full years, in the 4th year, we went through our renewal process, right? And so that's where they're really determining, okay, test scores aside, how strong is the quality of instruction? Does the quality of instruction match the test scores? In my first renewal, we underperformed. We outperformed the district in reading and underperformed in math. And when they came for the visit, instruction was so-so, right? And so because of that, we were placed on academic probation. What I can tell you is that had we also had a school culture that suggested that really nothing positive is going on here, that academic probation would have been a shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
We had dramatic gains the following year, and we were removed from academic probation, and we went on to enjoy the remainder of our charter. And I'm proud to say that even though I'm not there, the school just received a 5-year charter free and clear. Conversely, there was a school that in its first year, because of the way that they had chosen to open and the number of students that they had in comparison to having all of their infrastructure, if you will, down pat, had some challenges, an amazing vision, didn't make it through the full year, right? And so it really does run the gamut. And I do think that level of oversight it should be appreciated. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Because you don't deserve to operate if you're not going, that's the whole premise of this, right? If you're not going to provide the best, I don't care what your intentions are, but the best education for kids, then you just shouldn't be allowed to continue.
I would agree. There are several elements of oversight and accountability that are put into place, especially if you are a brand new school. And I would venture to say that any number of them could have you shut down relatively quickly. I would say that in my experience, what would get you shut down the fastest is financial. If you do not have your finances in place, if you do not have your finances in order, that I think is one of the fastest ways to get your school out of operation.
Sure. That's a remarkable statement and concept coming from the independent school world. Well, and really even the public school world, where it's openings and closings are determined by population, more or less. In the independent school world, we like to say it's determined by the market. It's interesting to think you could actually measure it by academic results.
Yes.
And, what a concept.
And in some ways, I would say in some ways we can be judged a bit more harshly than traditional public schools, whereas different districts have different rules, but you cannot have, in Florida, we have a very simple A through F rating, right? The way you would in a school, A, B, C, D, F. And if you have a D or F school, you are immediately put on probation. You are immediately put on a list, that the state watches you. And if you were to do that the second year, you may be shut down, and those calculations are extensive. And as Marche said, you are put on watch, and they come into your school and they make sure that you're doing certain things. You have improvement plans that you must meet these certain goals. You must match what you say you're doing to improve the school. And as Marche said, while it's a bit daunting, it is appreciated because we need to be doing what we say we're going to do for these kids.
To what extent does all of the oversight play into making admissions either difficult or easy? Like I would wonder, as you're talking about when you're going out to recruit students, asking them to believe in you and to give your school a chance. If it's just opening, are parents concerned about whether or not the school will exist, a couple of years down the road?
Admissions is an interesting word when it comes to charter schools because we don't really talk about admissions as much as enrollment, I would say, because for the most part, unless you have a school that has a very specific kind of theme, as we were saying earlier, if you're targeting there are exceptions for targeting certain populations. For example, if you have an arts charter, or if you have a charter that's specifically for students with autism or something like that, which those exist. And at that point, you can limit enrollment, but there are very strict rules about enrollment and limiting enrollment. So we don't really, at least where I work, we don't really discuss admissions as much as just enrollment and registration, because for the most part, anyone can enroll in the school. We do have a registration packet and it's not admissions, an application process, but that's because we need to have that information to enroll any child in our school legally. To make sure that you legally are the parent who's allowed to enroll this child in school and all of that documentation that goes with it. But for the most part, now I will say I have heard of stories and cases where there are barriers put into that enrollment process. And I think there's some flouting of the rules where we have some very negative stories that go around and rightly so, the media has pointed out that they may restrict certain students or certain groups from attending those schools. And that is not correct. And that should not be done. There are some safeguards in Florida for that. For example, you're not allowed to see certain things about a student before you allow them into your school. For example, you cannot restrict for GPA. You cannot restrict for exceptionality status if you're a student with disabilities. You cannot restrict for language status if you're an English language learner. You cannot restrict for income. You cannot restrict for race or sexual orientation or gender or any of these things. You cannot legally restrict or manage your application process in any of those ways.
I would say, and thank you, Sarah, for addressing the admissions, the use of the terminology admissions. And I would agree for sure. We speak in terms of enrollment and registration. In terms of when you're a new school, I think there are two avenues, right? If you're part of an existing network that has a strong reputation, then a new school is really resting on the reputation of that organization. If you're a standalone school, then what you really have is the conviction of the leader and the staff that goes before families, right? And the power of the mission and vision. And so you are not going to speak to everyone. And I think that gets back to the heart of what this is about. It's about school choice, right? So when I had to recruit parents, I'd have information sessions. Some parents knew right off the bat, okay, so this is not going to be a super structured drill and kill kind of school. This is going to be good for my younger child. This is not going to be good for my older child, who I think needs more structure, right? So I think that that it really goes back to, what is your mission? What is your vision? How do you as a leader and as a staff, depending, and that just depends on what iteration of the school it's in when you're actually doing that recruiting. But a lot of it is they're looking at the person in front of them when a school is brand new and it's an independent.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would also add, because I think, if you're not familiar with charter schools, you may have heard about lotteries and admissions processes and things like that. So what Marche said about, if you're already established, generally you may have a wait list, right? You may have more students interested in your school than you have spots available in your school. And so it really becomes kind of a supply and demand thing. So if there's more demand for spots in your school than you have, at times there can be a lottery for waitlist spots. There could be, it really depends on where you are, what the rules are governing admittance into these programs. For example, I know of a very interesting lottery and application process in Washington, D.C., where there is more demand for charter schools than there are charter schools at the moment. So in D.C., there is an extensive process where parents and children will apply to several schools. I think they get to choose up to 8 or something like that. Please forgive me if I'm saying wrong, but there is a process where they apply to all these different schools, and then the lottery determines which of those schools they are actually going to be admitted into. And I say admitted, but it's really an enrollment, because once they're chosen for that school, there are no other barriers. There's no tests. There's nothing they have to pass to get in. That is their assigned school. So it's interesting. And depending on where you are and what the demand is like for the charter school or for the spot, really, we talk a lot about spots and seats because it's kind of a numbers game when you're talking about perhaps there are more students than spots. That's when lotteries tend to come into place.
And I think, Sarah, this is a place where I think charters have served a lot of districts well. So in the city of Newark, when I started, we had a lottery. I'm talking like an old-fashioned barrel,
Yep.
pick the index card out and the name was on there. I think to your point about wait lists, as a new school, I think we had like a wait list of 6, right? And I'll never forget the first parent that we called off the wait list, but we didn't have enough of a reputation to have a hearty wait list. Fast forward 5 years later, and the city of Newark had been signed on to do a universal application. And so what that meant was that every parent, whether you were in a traditional district school or a charter school, could choose the school that they wanted their child to go to. So you no longer were bound by, I must go to the school across the street from my house because that's what the district says, right? And so you could choose district or charter. And that's what parents should have the right to do, right? That's what people who have the means to attend independent schools do. They determine what's best for my child and they choose. And so I think that is definitely a positive that has come out of the existence of charter schools in a lot of, metropolitan areas, if you will.
So I think we've ended up hitting actually multiple of our remaining questions, but I also want to be cognizant of, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to jump back to a super nuanced technical question that will probably get cut out because I think I'm the only person who's interested in this.
No, it's fine.
Okay. So legally, to a certain extent, an independent schools board is the school. It is a board of trustees. So in essence, you could fire everyone at the school, shut down the building, and the organization would still exist. Is that the case for a charter school board? It sounds like it's not.
In New Jersey, that is the case.
Okay, really? Wow.
I don't know if that's the case here. That is a good question. It may depend on where you are, but it may not, and I could just be ignorant of that.
Sure. Well,
but again, and another good point is that Marche has much more experience with a standalone school, and I'm thinking of a network. So they're in the network, the board. Yeah, if there were no schools, it's almost a philosophical question. I'd have to ask a lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, there's
would the organization exist without the schools? That's an interesting question.
Yeah. In New York and New Jersey, the Board of Trustees is effectively the school, right? They are the stewards of the charter. The charter is given by the state, but the board could say, you know what? Everyone from executive director down to, whatever, go, and we're going to start all over again. Now, I promise you, the authorizer would step in.
Yeah, exactly. Realistically, that's such an improbable situation. But I mean, technically, yes. I mean, they hire the principal, they make those decisions. So that's true. The board has the governing authority to determine all of that.
Now, and I think this is, I love that you asked the question, Matt, because I think it also touches on governance versus management. So in New Jersey,
where I was going. Yeah.
The authority of the board to fire staff begins and ends with the lead person or the executive director, CEO. Okay. So the board, while technically the board approves the termination of, if you have a lead person and then a principal on down, if you will, the board always approves those terminations, but it is according to state regulation, the approval of those terminations is at the recommendation of the lead person or superintendent, right? Gotcha. And so the board can't just say, well, we're going to fire teacher A and principal A. They can't do that. They can say, we'll fire our lead person / superintendent. And again, all of those titles vary based on the board, on the school district.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. That's true.
Okay.
So what does competition amongst charter schools look like? So, independent schools, I would say, are highly competitive, but also very collaborative. It's a small world. And so it's not uncommon for an independent school to send a group of faculty from one school to visit another to learn about innovative ideas and then come back. But yet they're all also in competition within, one market. What does competition look like among charter schools?
I'd say both and.
Yes.
So highly competitive. And at the same time, depending on the region and the city, may be very collaborative. So in Newark, we had an organization called the Newark Charter School Fund, which existed to support all charters in the city and always brought the charters together, right? So there were opportunities for us, whether we were independent, charter or part of a network. The fund really worked to ensure that we had access to one another instead of being in your own silo, and opportunities to collaborate. And so at the same time that we collaborate with one another, it was a really wonderful community in that school leaders would call each other across the city to talk about challenges or to ask for resources, or can I send a teacher over because I know your school does this really well. While that was happening, during enrollment season, we were also vying for the best billboard, right? Like, how could you put a billboard? I'll never forget, a network put a billboard about a block away from my school. And I was like, what?
Oh, that's cold. That's cold.
Yeah, so we've had very similar situations.
But part of that was that we had a mandate that we had to be sure that we were recruiting from all four corners of the city. So their billboard needed to be in my neighborhood and my billboard needed to be in their neighborhood, right? But the competitive nature of that, when you're just walking down the street and you see, oh, right, that charter exists. So very, it really was and is both of those things, collaborative in the cities and regions where that willingness is there. And I think some jurisdictions in New York and New Jersey have done a really solid job of bringing charters together. So that we're not, enemies while we are doing some healthy competition.
Absolutely. I would agree. And so working within a charter network that's a bit larger, it's a little bit unique because we have each other as a network to rely on across the country. However, things are very different, as you may have heard from this conversation, from district to district, from county to county. Things can be extremely different. So you do need to depend on other charter networks to kind of give you, help fill me in. What is this? What is this situation? I got this letter from the superintendent. What does this mean? I got this letter from this office. Can you help me figure out what this means? And they're coming to my school next week. Do you know what they're going to look for? Because to be completely honest, it's not always clear. All of these mandates exist, but we don't always know what those actually mean. So absolutely, a phrase that gets thrown around here a lot is cooperation, right? So we cooperate, we work together, but we are 100% in competition. And that competitiveness that Marche was talking about, that little bit of almost like territorial energy is there because, as you might imagine, we're all very high achieving and dedicated and passionate people. We had a similar situation like the billboard where sometimes, we'll text each other like, hey, my kid got this mailer from your school. What are you doing? But it, like she said, it is to provide more equity and make sure that we are reaching all of the kids, because we don't want it to turn into these geographic silos. We don't want it to be that. That would be making it exactly what we were designed not to be. So,
absolutely.
But yeah, there are some great opportunities for collaboration. Marche and I have both been fortunate enough to be a part of the National Charter School Conference, which happens annually. This last year, of course, was virtual, but they have local, by local, I mean state alliances and state consortiums that exist within that, which we can provide some resources for if anybody is listening is interested in learning more about that, or if you need some support. They are designed to support schools. Even they're not a CMO, they're not an LEA, they're not one of those things that we were talking about. They're just an organization. They are multiple organizations designed to support charters in different areas.
All right. So for this next question, I want to hear from both of you, and it's a two-parter. I would love to know what do you like most about charter schools, but what gets you up in the morning about charter schools? What keeps you engaged in it? And then the second part of the question is, I want to give you the chance to recruit an independent school teacher. So if I've been at a private school and I'm a good teacher and whatnot, and I'm interested in charter schools, why should I come over to charter schools from an independent school?
The first question is very easy to answer,
okay,
and that's the kids. The kids, the families, the children, the students, being able to be a part of their lives and to be a part of their families and to impact them in any way. We learn so much more from them than I think we could ever give them. So that's a very easy answer. Being a part of their lives is always worth it. And
nice.
Just hearing the different stories and learning from the experiences that they've had and their backgrounds, it's definitely makes every day worth waking up. And it's hard in this season of pandemic when we don't actually get to spend as much time with kids as we would like, or as much as I would like. Kind of hurts my heart a little bit, but miss seeing those kids every day.
Okay.
Marcia. Second part. I'm sorry, Matt.
Oh, well, all right. Yeah. So Sarah, what if
I wasn't sure if we were going to go like first question.
Yeah, no. Let's hear your second part and then we'll go to Marcia.
The second part, how can I recruit you to come work for me? Great question. I think actually a lot of what Marcia said earlier is that there is some flexibility and there is some autonomy in what is done. There's definitely, this is not the same in independent schools from what I've learned, but in traditional public schools, there are definitely a lot of mandates as far as curriculum. Not to say that doesn't exist in any charter schools, but there is a freedom and an innovation and a desire to change. So I think that's what's most exciting. When people ask me about why I work in charters, to be honest, it did not start as a philosophical decision, right? It wasn't an ideology that I was chasing. If I'm being honest, that's where I first got a job. That's sure, where I applied and I had a job. And what I learned from that experience is that I was given at a very early stage in my career, a lot of opportunities for advancement. And I was given a lot of opportunities to grow and learn and explore different areas. That doesn't always happen in some organizations. And I don't see that always in traditional public schools. And I don't always see that in independent schools. And I think there's a little bit of, I'm trying to think of the right word. I don't want to say that it's nepotism, but I think there's a level of seniority or, this is the way we do things in a lot of traditional settings, whether they are traditional public schools or independent schools, that I don't always see in charter schools. And so I would say that there's definitely a desire of, hey, I'm coming to you with this idea. I want to try something crazy. Can I do it? And I think I was working at the network that I work at now when I was still a classroom teacher, maybe a year or two, not even. And the teacher next door to me and I had an idea that we wanted to do something. We wanted to throw all our kids together in the media center and we wanted to set up these stations and we wanted to make it like, just this interesting setup that was, we were very new educators and we just had this crazy idea and we thought, let's try this. And we went to our principal and we said, we want to try this. And he said, 100%, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And it was a great experience to learn from. We were successful with it. Our kids, who are now very much into adulthood, they, sometimes we still see them and they say, we remember when you did this, we remember all of this. It's an opportunity to grow and it's an opportunity to learn that I think if you are the kind of educator who desires to learn, you're going to have an amazing experience.
Okay, Marcia, what do you love about charter schools and why should we go work there?
So a little bit of a deviation, but just needing to speak my truth. I am a staunch advocate for public school education.
Sure.
Whether it is district or charter. And so that's just important for me to say. I would say what I think is what I enjoy about charter schools goes back to that autonomy, right? And I think a lot of what Sarah just said really nails it. Mm-hmm. There is really the room to innovate. And very often, because in many cases, there are smaller environments, there are just rich relationships between teachers and students and teachers and families that you don't always experience in traditional public schools. And so I think the fewer restrictions that are on staff really leave room for those relationships to flourish and for a very different type of experience in a lot of situations. That being said, I think that not all charter schools are created equally. And so again, this notion of unique mission and vision and being able to, for a parent to be able to choose what really resonates with me in terms of what's best for my child, I think is really the power of charter schools. And I, again, want to restate, anywhere that charters have moved the needle on school choice, I think, bingo, we've done our job, right? Because that's what should be able to happen, because not every school is right for every child. I am not currently working in a charter school. I would say, though, if I were wanting to recruit, I'd say if there is a particular mission or purpose that you have that you are seeking to fulfill in your employment, not just the global purpose of a teacher, right? But like, I'm really committed to schools that say, although I think every public school tries to forward this idea that we're preparing students for college and career readiness because the standards tell us to, right? But there are social justice missions and themes, and I think that charter schools give folks the opportunity to choose the environments that speak to the missions that align with their own core values. And I think that's a great reason to join a charter school. If you believe that it takes all of that and then some to support children and to help them achieve at high levels, then I think charter schools are right for you, because they are roll up your sleeve, get down to the nitty gritty, and work hard for students. And that's not to say that traditional public schools don't do that. But I think there's a particular culture that is geared towards high levels of achievement and high levels of relationship overall.
Something that I feel like I've heard you both articulate about charter schools that I find really compelling, even as an independent school, someone who works at independent schools, is the idea that at a charter school, a lot of the freedom and autonomy that's given to the school is for the purpose of innovating and then learning from innovation for the greater good. That ideas could be then, taken and implemented more broadly. I think that's something that seems fundamentally unique about charter schools. Independent schools, I think, are also innovative, but I think often limited to just the school. So there's not really the opportunity for the level of impact that y'all are suggesting charter schools are aiming for. So that's a really compelling idea.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal. Absolutely. And I think Marche makes a good point. Just like it's hard to paint all independent schools with one brush, it's hard to paint all charter schools with one brush. This is definitely, I know Marche and I, when we were asked to be a part of this podcast, we both said, yes, but we are not experts. Meaning,
definitely
and
not an expert.
and in the sense that I don't think we would want to be considered as the spokespersons
No.
for not even for the schools that I work for. I wouldn't want to be painted in that light, because I believe that, we speak from our experiences and we're talking about the things that we've seen and the schools we've worked in, of course, but our personal experiences and our own philosophies and the way we work with families and the way we work with students. And that is not necessarily fundamentally true of every single school, even if we've worked there. So it is good to point out that if you are an educator listening to this and you're considering working for a charter school, understand the culture, understand the climate. And what Marche said, I think, is true. And I've noticed that in most of the charter schools that I've seen, is that there is this culture of high expectations and high relationships. That's part of what draws me there. I think that is very fundamental to who I am as an educator. But again, wouldn't say that everybody is exactly in that boat. So do your homework, do your research, and absolutely see if that's the right fit for you.
So, Sarah and Marche, we really appreciate you guys being on our show. As we get close to our wrap-up questions, Marche, I'd love to ask you about the new project you're working on with your new company, A New Blueprint. Can you talk to us about that for a minute?
Absolutely. So one of the things that actually a mentee of mine brought to light was that my current status seemed to be following a blueprint. And, you've left school leadership, at least for a season, and now you have decided that you will consult and coach leaders. And that seems to follow the blueprint. Like that's what principals do, right? School leaders burn out and then they go coach other people. And I really resented this statement and this summation of what I had chosen to do. But I actually spent some time reflecting on it, and I realized how much I have been following a blueprint subconsciously, right? There is a path that you take. You're a teacher, you happen to be a strong teacher, then you go into school leadership. You go into school leadership, you implement best practices. And I got stuck on this idea of best practices. And I think this is an area that charter schools often thrive in. And I also think there's a danger in the application of best practices. I entered the charter school space where the school of thought was very pervasive around what is the right way to teach Black and Brown children. This is the way you should discipline them. They need direct instruction all day, right? And these best practices that worked on the surface, right, and were elevating test scores and leading very often to controlled environments, sometimes detracted from the greater good that I think we wanted to do for children. And again, intent was always positive. And in many ways, I opened a school with some innovative ideas, but because of all of those regulations and all those best practices, by the time I left, I felt like we had really sort of been repeating the cycle or the blueprint. And so now, yes, I do enjoy supporting leaders, but I'm really very much interested in supporting leaders in developing a new blueprint. So my new company is A New Blueprint. And my goal is really to help folks reimagine what schools can look like, reimagine what your discipline practices and your instructional strategies look like. And it doesn't mean that we need to throw away every best practice, but we definitely need to be interrogating them. We need to be asking ourselves why and who does this produce 20, 30 years from now? And so that's what A New Blueprint is. It is a new consulting company that will support leaders and is supporting leaders in thinking about new ways, fresh ways of teaching and learning.
I love that. And how can people learn more about it and connect with your company?
Well, we are pretty brand new, but you can find me on Instagram at A New Blueprint. And there is a website in the making, which is right now marchenewkirk.com.
Awesome.
And speaking as someone who has had an amazing amount of free advice and resources from Dr. Newkirk, I am so excited for every leader in every school that gets to be a part of A New Blueprint.
Thank you, Sarah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we always finished our podcast with 3 questions. So why don't we, we'll pitch these to each of you, starting with Sarah. What should people be reading and what should people be listening to? And then how can people connect with you?
Well, I don't know what people should be reading, but I can tell you what I'm reading.
That works.
So I'm currently rereading Dr. Howard Stevenson's Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools. It's something that I read several years ago. And recently I read for the first time How to Be an Anti-Racist, which by Ibram X. Kendi, which as an educator, I think we all should read and learn from. And I had done some reading for personal growth about just how to be an anti-racist and reading about that philosophy. And so I kind of had the desire to go back and reread some of the other things that I've been reading that I had read in the past. I think, of course, I'm a literacy educator at heart. So of course I'm a fan of rereading, but I am a big believer in, you're in different seasons of your life and things may hit you a different way. So I wanted to reread that and see what I could glean from it in this season of my life and see what I could be bringing to the educators I work with and how I can impact the students that I have influence over in my role. So that's what I am currently reading, or rereading, I should say. As far as what should people be listening to, if I can be, gross self-promotion, as far as I also have a podcast that I work on called Big Ideas in Education, which is not contrary to what you might believe based on this conversation. It's not a charter school focused podcast, but just about things that are happening in the world and in K-12 education that we're interested in. It's very conversational, very informal. I do like Michael's podcast and Matt's podcast right now. Full Stack Educator is a good podcast. Better Leaders, Better Schools is another one that I've listened to. But I'll be honest, and I think you may share this. Sometimes we feel like it's hard to get educational podcasts that are really easy to listen to, or maybe just to get their names out there, to find them. So I'm always looking for suggestions, and I think that that's a good thing to share. And as far as how can people connect with me, I am on Twitter at readwithfi, F-Y-E. And I'm on Instagram at flywithfi, F-Y-E. And I think that's it. I can't remember, but I'm sure if I do, I'll send that information to you.
Your podcast is A+, by the way.
Thanks, Michael. We are very close to 100 episodes, which kind of blows my mind that I've recorded 100 episodes of anything, or 100 is kind of insane, but
that's amazing.
Yeah, it kind of is.
That's fantastic.
Lots of content to catch up on, but it's not sequential. So if you just want to listen to any episode, you'll find something.
All right, Dr. Newkirk.
Well, there's definitely some overlap. Sarah, it's so funny. I've been thinking about picking up Promoting Racial Literacy. It
deserves a reread,
right now, right?
I think. Yeah, I think it merits a reread right now.
Absolutely. So I think there are 3 books that are top of mind for me right now. One is How to Be an Anti-Racist, which Sarah just mentioned, by Ibram X. Kendi. The other, interestingly enough, is White Fragility. And there's a third book. Who's the author of White Fragility, folks? My goodness.
Robin DiAngelo.
That's her, Robin DiAngelo. Thank you. Don't tell her I couldn't remember her name. And then there's a book on my bookshelf, We Want to Do More Than Just Survive, by Bettina Love, that I am just getting into, really excited about. I think that too often in education, that is exactly what we've been doing, just surviving rather than thriving as educators, but also seeing our kids thrive. My podcast game is super weak, y'all. So I am with Dr. Phi and Dr. Lamusio and McGee here in terms of your 2 podcasts. I've got some catching up to do.
I feel like with the pandemic and the quarantine, my podcast game has gotten weaker and weaker because I'm just not in the car as much. Yes. I'm not on the road as much. And so that's when I would catch up on my podcast. So that I think a lot of us are in that boat.
You're so generous for that. Dr. Phi, I appreciate you. In terms of how to get in contact with me again, I am just newly on Instagram at anewblueprint.com. And there is a website, Marsha Newkirk. I'm sorry, A New Blueprint is my Instagram handle. And there's a website, marshanewkirk.com. There is nothing there yet, so be patient with me. And then there's always good old-fashioned email, anewblueprint@outlook.com.
Awesome. I will put links to all of those resources and ways to connect with y'all in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on our show today. We really appreciate both of your time and expertise, sharing your experiences in charter schools. It sounds like an amazing and interesting world. And I am so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.